Welcome everybody to the Arkansas Arts Center and our Scholars Day celebrating Becoming John Marin, Modernist at Work. My name's Todd Herman, the Executive Director, and you probably know that this is a first for the Arts Center and that we are live streaming this conversation on Facebook. So this is being shown to as many people as want to click on it and find out more about John Marin. So we are so excited today to have a very distinguished panel to discuss the exhibition, discuss John Marin. And I'm going to introduce them, I guess, I'll start right here with Shelley Langdale, who is currently the Associate Curator of Princeton. Well, I say currently, I mean, I'm not going anywhere. Shelley Langdale, Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The Philadelphia Museum is a lender to the exhibition. They have the largest collection of John Marin etchings and etching plates, and Shelley is a contributor to the catalog. Next to her is Jody Rodgers, who is research assistant at drawings, prints, and graphic design at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. She is the co-curator of the exhibition and co-author of the catalog. We then have Ruth Fine, who is retired as the curator of modern and American prints and drawings and curator of special projects at the National Gallery of Art. The National Gallery is also a lender to the exhibition. They have the largest collection of John Marin works in the world. We now rank second, thanks to our wonderful gift of 290 drawings and watercolors by John Marin from the artist's daughter-in-law, Norma Marin. And finally, to my far right is someone who you all know, Ann Wagner, who is our curator of drawings here at the Arkansas Arts Center, and has been working on this exhibition for probably since you arrived, yes, exactly. And so I know that she, as the rest of us, are so excited that the project has come to fruition. It's beautiful. If you haven't already gone through the exhibition to see it, please do so after this conversation. I'm sure you'll have a deeper understanding of the exhibition after you hear what our panelists have to say today. So finally, before I turn it over to them, I just want to show you the catalog, which is available and is heavy. And so it is available in the gift shop. And after this conversation, the authors will be available to sign copies. So here's your opportunity to get those signatures on your copy of the catalog. So I'm just going to turn it over now to our panelists to begin this interesting discussion on the work of John Marin.
Well, and we will get a little introduction to John Marin and his drawings from Ruth Fine, whose 1990 exhibition on John Marin at the National Gallery is one of the chief inspirations for all of our contemporary Marin scholarship. So there's our slide with the earliest dated John Marin drawing surviving, as well as one of his early watercolors.
Okay. I suppose I should tell you a little bit about John Marin. He died in 1953, and in 1948 he was voted by Life magazine as the most popular or the best or most famous artist in America. And he was a member of the Stieglitz Circle, and he did thousands of works of art, starting in the late 19th century and going up to right before he died. And I just picked a few slides to put together to give you some sense of changes that happened in his work, but also in terms of similarities that happened in his work. But I thought I would just say before I get to that I think you're very fortunate to have an opportunity to see this exhibition alive and in person firsthand, those of you that are here, because you all know there's no way to see a work of art except by seeing a work of art. And this is certainly the first opportunity to see the range of John Marin's works on paper and to be able to make comparisons between his drawings and his prints and his watercolors, and a few oil paintings as well to give an overall context. He's certainly best known for his watercolors, but he did do oil paintings throughout his life, and at the end of his life, he did the largest number, really focused on them at that point. But you also see multiple versions of specific subjects. So you see, I mean, we all know that Cézanne did sunflowers throughout his life, or Cézanne did Mont Saint-Victoire throughout his life. And in a sense, Marin is doing the same thing, perhaps in this exhibition, most beautifully with the Brooklyn Bridge. And you'll see very early Brooklyn Bridge etchings and drawings, and much later Brooklyn Bridge etchings and drawings. And at the lower right, there's a photograph so that you can connect what he was looking at with what he did with it. And multiple states of etchings or multiple subjects done very, very quickly. Brooklyn Bridge #2 and #1 from 1944 are hanging very close to each other. That's the one that's in the upper right. But if you want to go back one, Anne, I wanted to talk about the fact that almost all of Marin's work on paper, especially unique work, is multimedia. And it's wonderful to look at the differences between the multimedia. The image on your left, this early drawing, is a very meticulously drawn with graphite, showing you the kinds of skills and the kind of attention that he paid to the details of whatever he was looking at, whether it was landscape or architecture. And these two feature landscape and architecture, which essentially are subjects that go throughout his life. But what fascinated me in looking at this Edgewater on Hudson, New Jersey object was how close it really is to what he did in the very latest works, that he started out with meticulous drawing, which got looser and looser and looser, and there are extraordinary drawings that are just a few lines in the exhibition. They're beautiful. But these patches of color that are in the watercolor that's at the right are very much what he will do in the much later watercolors from the 40s and 50s, and in the oil paintings he does too. So we can jump over to this. And these are the very late ones. They're two different sizes. In one of them, in the smaller one on the left, the graphite drawing is very, very carefully done. In the one on the right, it's much more loosely done. Marin did not start out tight and end up loose. He sort of, throughout his career, would be very meticulous. Some of the things that you look at in looking at the show are the way he does buildings, the way he boxes in figures, and you see him doing this again and again, juxtaposing very specific and particular kinds of forms with very loosely painted forms, elements that are very finished and elements that are very unfinished. I just saw the show for the first time this morning. I had nothing to do with the catalog. I take no credit for anything that's in the Arkansas Art Center. But it was remarkable to realize, first of all, how much I still love the artist. I haven't done serious work on him for several years. But also how many questions there still are about his work, how much there is to discover about what he's doing. I think there's so much to be learned, and if you do buy that huge, impressive catalog, even after you read it all, they haven't answered all the questions. There are still lots of things to be written about and answered, and one of the things we've had fun doing this morning is talking about all the things that are left, and so I hope some of that will come up as everyone else talks to you from a much more educated point of view than I am.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to go back just a moment and mention that Marin studied both architecture and fine art. So he was well trained, but he was always very, very independent. He would never sit still for formal training very long. So when you see him doing architecture in his drawings, he really knows what he's talking about. He did design some buildings, he did design some houses. He said for comfortable living. And so when he does these drawings, he's often gathering architectural information in a very educated and specific kind of way, but then he'll often juxtapose it with lines that show you the gesture he feels in the building and the motion of people and animals around it. And so you will see these interesting combinations of different kinds of drawing. But I want Jody to talk to you about some of her discoveries about some of these early drawings after his architectural studies, but as he's getting going in fine art and very much illuminated by them, works that are of a kind that people don't normally associate with Marin, but he absolutely did them. And Jody figured out where and how and why.
Well, hi, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd also like to thank Anne and Todd and Brian and all the staff here at the Arkansas Arts Center. I've been a research assistant on this project, and then I became co-curator for the exhibition, which was really exciting. And I think what Anne one of them, and actually you can, it's not hard to see it in the slide, but it actually has Pier 17. And so that is how I was able to locate it directly on Pine Street. And what also was so exciting about this drawing is that we know through his biography that he was selling drawings in New York at this time to raise money to move to Paris. And yet there hadn't really been identified any final or formal drawings that he was selling. And I actually think with the way this is composed, the paper, the size, and the signature, that this is actually one that he could have potentially sold at the time. We had other sketches that he was looking at other buildings and horse-drawn carriages and similar subject matter, but I think with the way that the street corner is figured, it's a complete composition. And the other thing that's really exciting about it, and Anne helped me kind of pull out these details, is that there's actually in the lower right corner, there's a photographer, and right in front of the building. So I think Marin throughout his life, as Anne and Ruth had just kind of pinpointed the comparison with the photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge, he was always really well aware of other artists and of other time periods. And this was also an important area in New York at the time, because it was, there were all these debates about cleaning up the area, because a lot of the shipments and the business of the port was being moved to the west side of the city. And so he was always on the pulse of the time and really interested in how the life of New York City was changing and evolving. And so this was a very specific period for him, which after he returns to New York only 5 years later, he returns to the same area, and that's when he starts really depicting the City Hall Park. So.
And I think it's fascinating to see how detailed a story that he tells. He's not just describing architecture, he makes you feel like he's there, and he'll be interested in particularly waterfront views, both in Maine, which was where he spent his summers from 1914, most of his summers from 1914 on. There were a couple of years when he was in New Mexico, but he's always fascinated by the ships, the water, the coming and the going, fishermen, traders, all this life. And he tells stories, you feel like you could feel the life of the place. But one of the other places where, and this is a type of art that I think people don't associate with Marin, but that he was doing early on. And Jody and I were able to figure out that although Marin studied in both Philadelphia and New York, and Philadelphia, of course, has an excellent zoo, and New York has the Central Park Zoo, but because of a drawing that shows a sculpture that was installed, a monument that was installed in 1903, that is just barely down from where the zoo is in Central Park, and then of course he leaves for Europe later on in 1905, these drawings of animals. He's not well known for animals, but Jody found some wonderful pictures. They show you the bars, they show you the visitors, they show you the zoo. But Marin just projects right through, and he shows you the animals. He shows you the animals as characters. He shows you the animals in motion. And this is actually an interest that will continue his whole life. There are horses, particularly, that show up on the streets of New York, but also the streets of Paris. And Shelley, this is one of your etchings that I think you said that's a unique,
Yes.
really early one from when he's just gone to Paris and he's hoping that he can make a living, as he did for a while, selling tourist etchings.
Yeah, so he, when John Marin arrived in Paris in 1905, this was, I think you would all concur, sort of his last chance. He had dabbled in architecture. He finally went back to art school. He was in his 30s, and his dad was like, okay, I've carried you long enough. You got to get a real job and start making your own life. I'll send you to Paris. His brother was there, could set him up. He was going to take some classes at the École des Beaux-Arts. And we know that when he left, he had apparently purchased Maxime Lalanne's manual of etching. Now, up to that point, Marin had not made etchings, but we know that his brother also had access to an etching press that he made available to Marin, and he began just purely on his own to experiment with making etching. And because he had a limited allowance from his dad, this was a way also that he could make money. Whistler had just died in 1903, and I'm sure Jody will chime in more about Whistler and his big influence on Marin. But there were a lot of Whistler exhibitions. Certainly, Marin was aware of Whistler's amazing etching and watercolors and other artwork. And there was also a great interest in wonderful views of Paris, of different parts of Europe that would have appealed to a tourist market, so he could have made some money doing this. Interestingly, we don't know that he had a particular dealer in Paris that sold his etchings, but we know that he did have a dealer in Chicago who had come to Paris and provided a channel through which he could sell his etchings. So this is one of the first etchings that we know he made. It's in single impression. We don't know of any others. Interestingly, the drawing on the left from the Arkansas collection, we actually don't know if that's in New York or Paris because it's you can't quite place it like Jody was able to do with some of the other drawings. But what's interesting to look at here is the comparison of the handling of line. One of the things that I think is most compelling to me about Marin as an artist is, like other great artists before him and after him, Rembrandt and Picasso, I think there are few artists who are just so amazing at integrating language across media, and Marin is certainly one of them. And sort of using experience in one medium to translate into another in terms of how they compose images, how they use line, how they use color. And Marin is one of those artists that throughout his life would go back and forth between these different media throughout his career. And what it's interesting to look at here is look at how he's creating areas of hatching with parallel lines, building up shadow, building up areas, tonal areas. You'll also see it's a little. I hope you'll have to go look in the galleries to really see it closely. But what I noticed is that he really developed a sort of his own language or syntax, if you will, of staccato-like lines, of really energetic squiggly lines, of very more uniform parallel lines that he goes to again and again to create the structures that fill out his compositions. And one of the things as many comparisons as there are between the sort of free approach, the drawing-like approach to etching that you see in both Marin and Whistler's prints, and a difference that I see in Marin and others, and Ruth and Martha Tedeschi and others have pointed out, is this real sense of energy And Anne and I were even talking about it this morning, even looking at the bear. If you look at the bear, his drawing of the bear, there are these little staccatos that just stick out defining his claws, or pick up a little stronger area of contour on his back. And you're not even aware of how this contributes to your sense of the bear moving along, that he's not just a simple solid sculpture. And this kind of linear language comes up again and again throughout Marin's work. So I don't know if you want to go to the next.
Yeah, so was that one, and I just wanted to point out, while we're looking at that comparison, it's not a straightforward sketch for the etching, but there's so much in common in the way he sees the horse, and this is something you'll see over and over with Marin. He never directly translates a sketch to another medium, or indeed, as he's moving, say, between different versions of an etching, there are always changes, often very profound ones, and he's never just using printmaking or any other medium just to transfer an idea that he had. The idea is always growing and changing, and it's really very dynamic.
Can I just interject one thing? Because
Oh,
I
of
think
course.
it's been implied but not actually said, is that one word that's associated with Marin all the time is motion.
Yes,
And we're all kind of
absolutely.
talking about motion of various sorts, the motion of the drawing, the motion of things moving. But I think that's the word that you need to keep sort of at the front of your mind when you're thinking about him and how that functions throughout the work,
Always.
no matter what medium he's using. And of course, one of the things that's so great about the show is the possibility of really understanding this notion of a cross media. I can't think of a show really that's given that much possibility to really understand. I mean, the Becoming John Marin is a great title because it really gives you information about that.
Yeah,
Well, and I think one
thank
thing
you,
the
Todd, about
collection
the
really
idea.
focuses on is the act of drawing and how it was so essential for everything he did in his career. And so I think that's something that Anne and I have spent a lot of time, and Shelley with the etchings, really thinking about how this language he creates for himself is developed.
Yeah,
and
you
see
really
it
feel
so
his hand
early
at
on,
work.
and he stays with it through the 1950s.
And what's remarkable really is that etching is an indirect process.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's maintaining the liveliness of the direct drawings while working with the indirect process of etching, where you draw on a plate and it goes through the etching, and it's got all these involvements
Yeah.
that drawing doesn't have,
We
but yet
may-
the freedom of it is so phenomenal.
Well, and we should say, because we shouldn't assume that everyone understands what an etching is. So very quickly, you have a copper plate that has a ground on it. Think of it like a varnish, like the plate has been varnished. And if you take a sharp tool, and you can somewhat draw into the plate, and in the process of drawing with that tool, you remove some of the varnish ground. It exposes the metal underneath. So wherever you've drawn, when you dip that into an acid bath, the acid bites down into the plate, creating recessed lines wherever you drew. You remove the varnish from the plate, you ink the plate, you put it face down on the paper and run it through the press, and the ink is pushed out of those lines and onto the paper. So you reverse your image because you draw on the plate this way and then you print it through the press that way. So you have to be thinking backwards when you're creating your drawing. So as Ruth rightly pointed out, it's an indirect process, and you have to be able to be imaginative enough to see what it's going to look like in reverse. But as we'll see, that actually kind of delighted Marin, I think. I think he liked the idea of having yet another way of iterating an image, of looking at an image in a different direction.
I'll move on to just show a couple of the drawings that he did in Paris. He really starts to get into the life of the city, makes you feel as if you're right there with him, brings the point of view, in this case, down among the people who are sitting at tables in apparently a cafe that has been set up at the Vendôme column for some kind of a celebration. And then we've borrowed a drawing from Colby College that shows a carousel going around. And carousels were just as popular in Europe as America, if not more so. And he's starting to introduce pastel color into this, and they're very lively and wonderful, and it's the type of thing that will go into his watercolors and his mature works. And this is also the type of drawing and lively watercolors like this that Edward Steichen, the great photographer and painter, spotted in Marin's work in Paris. So then he points Marin's work out to Alfred Stieglitz, great photographer, but also great promoter and seller of American modern art, and early on in particular, European modern art in New York, the man who communicates modernism in New York. So this is the type of work that gets him excited, and therefore he picks up Marin as one of the first great members of his stable of American artists. So for most of the rest of his career, Marin can count on at least one good show a year in New York. So this is the point from these early European works where suddenly the boy who couldn't figure out a way to make a living finds a career, finds somebody who will champion him, and finds his audience in America, and he becomes very, very popular. And these are some of the really late etchings.
Was that the drawing we thought had a self-portrait in it?
Oh,
Yeah.
that's right, yes, find out that.
I have no idea.
It looks like maybe.
But the lower right-hand figure in the drawing on the right just somehow jumped out as being a possible self-portrait. So maybe, may not be, but they're the kind of questions that I think we all came up with as we were wandering around this morning.
And
Looks a
these
lot
are a
like
couple
them.
of the really lively etchings, the type of things that Stieglitz said that he loved. Marin would say, oh, my dealers would never be able to sell these. They're too non-realistic, they're too abstracted, they're too lively, they're too not literal. But Stieglitz said, you know, if I could do work like that, you know, I would tell the dealers to go jump. And so it's this type of etching. But Shelley, these are yours.
Yeah, well, yes, they are. They actually literally belong to our museum. But no, these are two good examples of both the way that, you know, one of the things that people tend to associate with printmaking, obviously, is that you make multiples, right? That they're the same. Well, that was not really at all Marin's chief interest in etching, I would say. What you'll notice even in the example on the right, the old house on the Rue de Rouen of Arpin, there are actually fingerprints where he pushed ink around on the plate. You can see the signs of his pushing the ink around on the plate. And there's an impression actually in the Cleveland collection that says no two impressions, or each impression different, which so shows you that he liked that idea. And so really etching for him is as much about the kind of line that he could develop with it, the kind of effects he could get, atmospheric effects he could get with pushing ink around on the plate, leaving some ink on the plate instead of wiping it perfectly clean. The example on the left, the Cathedral Rouen from 1909, and this is now, I should say, he was making these after he returned from visiting his show, the first show that he had at Stieglitz Gallery in New York. So he has now Marin's confidence that there's someone out there who approves of what he's doing, who's going to support him in his new way of approaching things. And one of the important aspects about the Rue des Arpins that I don't want to forget to say is that this is one of two different prints of this same subject on completely different etching plates. The more typical approach that an etcher would take to a plate if they wanted to change something small in the actual plate, change a few lines, maybe erase some lines, draw some extra lines, we call that a different state. So you'd have your plate, you'd make the changes, you'd print it again, but you're working from the same etching plate to make different impressions. Marin was like, oh, I'm going to start on a whole new sheet of paper, a whole new copper plate. He would go from copper plate to copper plate. Instead of just making a change to the same plate, he'd take up a whole new copper plate and make another etching of almost exactly the same subject with just a little change. He wasn't thinking about it in the same way of just producing multiples of the same thing over and over again. It was a very different way of engaging with etching, and much more about the process and about the kind of imagery and line that he could get from it than about producing a multiple of some kind. The work on the left is a great example. I think you can see, hopefully, if not here, you can get up close and see the incredible energy of line. If you look at the contour and the way that that tower is described, you have this incredibly nervous line that's sort of going up the edge of the contours of the building. It doesn't seem to sit still. And again, that's a very evocative way of the way we actually see. Your eye doesn't really settle on anything for that long. You sort of see it in motion, as Ruth was saying. It's an experience rather than a solid single thing. And this is an example that I think, again, both Ruth and Martha have commented. You see in this 1909 image of the Rouen Cathedral, this religious structure, the kind of experiential evocativeness that he later imparts to the giant tall skyscrapers that were soaring in New York, changing the skyline in really dramatic ways when he returns in 1910.
Now, we're going to have to
Yes,
move ourselves
please do.
along. So when he gets back to New York, he discovers they've been building skyscrapers in his absence. The city has transformed. The modern era of skyscrapers in New York has begun. And he makes these fabulous watercolors and almost immediately starts to make etchings of what he's seeing in New York. So he saw old towers in Europe. He saw new towers in the United States. So he was fascinated by the changes in America. Anybody have a comment on this before we go off to some of the things around City Hall Park, which became
Well, just
central?
really briefly, I want to say that I think it's very interesting that he's producing these very washy, very open, loose, free images at the same time that he's producing these incredibly linear etchings.
Absolutely.
So these things are sort of happening simultaneously, and then they kind of become united at different points moving forward.
Yeah, this is the thing, is that you'll see Marin doing different kinds of things at the same time. It's a matter of what he's trying to accomplish. So here are two of...
Just quickly, sorry,
Sure.
if we go back, I do want to make a point though. A lot of the things that I was looking at when we were pulling from the collection, these were things that he was experiencing. So we know he took the
Yes.
ferry very frequently. These are images that he became enthralled by the city, but here these are both the Manhattan skyline from New Jersey going across. So we know that he really had an everyday kind of experience of drawing or thinking of color, and a lot of the stuff that we've pulled for the exhibition, I think were kind of notes to himself, but then also were, you know, part of the process of creativity, which building into the next.
Well, and he lived
Absolutely.
in New Jersey.
Yeah,
He
right.
didn't-
Yeah,
he was
didn't
right
live in
across
New
the
York,
river.
Yeah.
So he was always
It was
going
always
to
going
New York.
in and coming. I
And
think
here-
yeah.
And here he's
Rarely.
making
Yeah.
drawings of the municipal building, which was being built in 1912 on City Hall Park, which is very far down Manhattan. It's very close to Ground Zero, where the 9/11 took place. And so very close to the Brooklyn Bridge, very close to lots of new buildings that were going up. And you can see he's fascinated by the scaffolding, the cranes, the transformation. So you see here both two sketches that would have been just for his own use. They're probably made on just informal pads of writing paper, very small, but something he could walk around the streets and draw. And then he would go back to his studio in New Jersey and make more completed watercolors. So this one that belongs to the Met shows you, in essence, the color version, but also you won't find a sketch that's exactly like it. He transforms it. He doesn't just add color, he changes the composition. In this case, notice there's this tree in the foreground. It's still there 100 years later, more than 100 years later. And he keeps fighting with it. It's in his way. He wants you to probably to feel the strength of the tree, the motion of the tree growing up as the building is going up. And by the way, we have to watch ourselves. We're pointing at something they can't see. They see that. We're seeing this. But so you can see that the tree is growing up as the building is growing up. But this is right across the square from the Woolworth building, which was going up at the same time in 1912 and would be the tallest building in the world. So it got a lot of attention. And so Marin stood in City Hall Park, where you could stand back from the building a bit. I mean, it's terribly towering. There's only so far back you can get. And so Jody can pick up the story where he's looking for points of view and trying to figure out how to capture this building.
Well, the Woolworth Building in 1913, the watercolors, when they're first shown by Stieglitz in 291 Gallery, and then also at the
That's
Armory
the
Show,
O's.
really made a career for John Marin. And to this day, I think he had the largest impact of his work was when it was shown in that context. But the powerful thing with kind of looking at the drawings here at the Arkansas Art Center is that it gives us the opportunity to see how he was really studying the Woolworth Building for many days, if not weeks at a time. And his drawings are, I believe, to be completed, in front of the building or in the park, and really he spends time there. And we do also have, if you keep going, to the next one, sorry. The watercolor on the left here is a really interesting, and when I first came to see the collection, this was one drawing that I was really drawn to, because one of the most important aspects of Marin work is color. And I know we're talking about action and how important line is and that part of it, but his watercolors, the visceral reaction that you have to them is also really linked to the bright colors and the color of the sheet and so some of the wonderful works in the collection here, you can still see the true value of what he was working with. And this is just the case. Even though it's a drawing that we've had the same question of whether it's finished or not finished, I do believe that this was something he was in process of, because we have so many other drawings that related to it. But here you can really see how he's playing with the greens of the leaves and the almost reddish and yellowish tones of the scaffolding, and then these deep purples. And so a lot of the finished watercolors that were shown in 1913 and then kind of praised, a lot of those colors have faded. So this gives us a real opportunity to take another look at these great masterpieces and see them for this kind of missing color or accepting the loss of what we have today. So in my essay, I do spend a lot of time with looking at the works, the drawings from City Park and around in 1912 and 1913, and seeing how they can help us recreate the experience that he was having himself in front of the building, but then also what he was trying to provoke for the audience. And emotion is a big thing in the energy, but I do think that these are just a fabulous example of what brought him to the area, why he was so intrigued by the development of the Woolworth Building, and how that can lead us into, really defining his own line, and he really became a modernist after this point.
So there are the famous ones that were shown in the Armory Show. They're at the National Gallery. It's amazing. And here is this incredible etching that was done at about the same time, where he's interpretively inking on the plate, a unique impression.
Yeah, and this is an extraordinary print for several reasons, but one, again, at this point, we just should reiterate, he's no longer really caring about selling prints for a market. This is an integrated part of his modernist exploration. This is only known in, I believe, 2 or 3 impressions. We have one of them. Each is uniquely inked. So you see, again, wonderful fingerprints along the bottom of the composition. And you'll also notice that there are areas where he seems to have scratched away ink. They're like white scratched out areas where he simply either used a matchstick or his finger or something to scrape out areas of the plate. And one of the things that was most striking about the image is the way the building seems to glow. Not only is it swaying, talking about motion again, sort of the energy of the city, which is often discussed in reference to these images, but also it seems to almost be lit up, and it was. The Woolworth Building, if you don't know, was the first building lit from the outside that was actually at night. And when the Woolworth Building opened, the president artificially pushed, push a fake button in his office in Washington, D.C. to light up the Woolworth building in New York City. So this was had a huge impact on the look of the city in New York, and it would have been an extraordinary thing, I think, captured here better than anywhere else I've ever seen.
That's amazing.
And so you not only have, again, this could not be further, I think, from what most people think of as a replicable image. I don't think he could have replicated this image, but it feels, you can feel his process and the creation of this image just by looking at it. And at the same time, it captured this incredible experience in a really evocative way.
And I just we're going to have to wrap it up before we go to questions here, which is there's a lot of work left. Just wanted to let you know there were other buildings he was very interested in. The telephone building was one of them, now the Verizon building. We have this very abstract little drawing, and very clearly this fabulous watercolor from Crystal Bridges is really what it was for. You can put them together. It's got a flag on the top of it so that you can spot it, but it has so many complicated points of view. Marin drew it and painted it and made prints of it again and again and again. So there were lots of buildings he was fascinated with. These tiny little ones, one from our collection and one that's at Ranolda House, probably the same building, very abstracted. These are just tiny little guys. And, but he was also interested in the motion of the people moving around in the streets. So particularly from the 30s on, you'll see a lot of these drawings of people in motion, and then they show up in these completed watercolors. We don't have these in our collection, but the ability to put our drawings of people in motion next to these watercolors from the Phillips collection and the Philadelphia Museum shows you how the drawings, he would be drawing upon dozens of drawings for these. There'd be drawings of the buildings, drawings of the composition, drawings of the people, but then also getting the color in there. And of course, you can't work in the streets of New York and set up an easel and do a big painting on the streets of New York. You've got to draw on something small and take it back to your studio. But you can do, so we'll have to race through
yes,
these.
Yeah, we'll just make this an assignment. You should go into the galleries, and there are two extraordinary studies for the Brooklyn Bridge on the bridge from 1944, and then we also lent two etchings and the etching plate. And what is this is the classic, I think, example of how John Marin doesn't really use a study per se.
Yeah,
he studies things and they build in his imagination and they come out on paper in watercolor etching or graphite or charcoal or watercolor. And if you look at these initially like, oh, this must be a study for that, they're very similar. As soon as you start thinking that, the more you start looking at them, the more different you see how different they are. The way that the angle of the bridge, the angle of the street, the way that the road is defined, what you can see or not see through the verticals of the bridge. He changes it up in each version, just constantly sort of trying to convey how different things look depending on the time of day, the weather, what kind of mindset you're in, whether you're noticing the architecture or whether you're noticing the weather and the atmosphere.
Now go and compare, because they're all different. And here's another one where you won't see an exact sketch for this amazing little watercolor of the docks and the warehouses in Weehawken, right by where he lived and where it gave him a fabulous view of New York. But he will learn, he'll be doing drawing, watercolor, building up his ideas, showing, exploring how it felt, how it moves, how things move back and forth as the site of so much activity, trade, ships coming and going, people working. And I think we can't even really get seriously into how abstract he gets with these etchings and how abstract he gets with the watercolors. But I just wanted to point out, when he went and did summers in Maine, there he could set up an easel and work relatively at his leisure in front of nature. There are drawings of Maine, as you'll see on the right there. There are drawings of trees and things from the landscapes, but he didn't have crowds of people surging around there. So when he's doing drawings like this one of the Palisades, very close near New York City, or near Gloucester, New Jersey, he can just draw on the full-sized watercolor paper, drew a watercolor over it, add back in lines that he really wants you to see. He can show you the whole process, and he doesn't have to make little sketches and go home with them. He can do the whole thing full scale right there. And he does the same thing clambering around on the rocks and hills and looking at the trees in Maine. And we'll just mention that, and we can talk further through questions, that late in life he gets very interested in female figures. But again, this is one where there are, what, 5, 6 etchings of the same subject?
Yes, and this, yes.
And ours is a drawing that's related, but it's not exactly the same as anything.
And none of the etchings are the same either. And none of the etchings are the same either. Yeah.
So now we can go to questions that we can take from people who have, if you can hand in questions that you have, and we have some questions. Okay, we have one where it says, the etching of Rouen Cathedral seems impressionistic in its composition. Monet did a whole series of paintings of the same building. Was Marin influenced at all by the Impressionists? Good question where he might have given you, depending upon when you asked him, a different answer, and perhaps his answer would have been different from our answer.
Yeah, I don't know how others feel about that. I think he's really much more influenced by Whistler and the etchings of Whistler than he would be by the paintings of
And probably Cézanne.
Yeah, and Cézanne too. Yeah.
Tries to deny that because he's trying to express himself as the complete Americanist. But as Ruth and other people have said, he had images on the walls of the same shows with Cézanne. He had to have seen his work, and you see it very exactly
I also think
represented.
Stieglitz had a huge role in that too,
I think so.
of kind of marketing him when
Yes.
he's back in New York.
And I think every artist is influenced by everything that went
Yeah.
on. So
I
of course
think
he was
absolutely.
influenced by the
Although
Impressionists. But I agree with you that Whistler, he was consciously and actively influenced by, and you can make really clear connections.
Yeah.
But you can't have been in Paris at that
Yeah.
moment without
I can't
being
imagine.
hit by it.
And I think that, but I mean, there again, it's not, that particular comparison, I mean, he's much more interested in the line, which is not what was so
No, the Impressionists
emphasized in the
were
Impressionists.
color people
it was
rather
more
than
color
line people.
and, yeah.
Okay, another good one. What other artists did Marin interact with? Of course, immediately comes to mind the other Stieglitz Circle artists. Of course, Stieglitz himself, a photographer. You'll definitely see the same subjects showing up in Stieglitz and Steichen's photographs and Strand's photographs, and in some of Marin's watercolors and etchings and drawings. But also somebody like, say, O'Keeffe is probably looking at Marin's work. They're certainly very close friends.
Well, he went to New Mexico.
Yeah, they went together. Well, and he's the one who drove them back from their wedding when Stieglitz and O'Keeffe got married in 1925. And was it a light pole he drove into? He was so excited. Nobody was hurt in the end, but it was scary at the time because Marin was so excited. He certainly knew and I think influenced a great many artists in addition to seeing them himself.
Well, and as you already mentioned,
Yeah.
Steichen was
And
someone
certainly
that he met, you know, that was how he met Stieglitz, and we know they were close for.
And he was
some
friends
time.
with a lot of the artists when he was studying at the Pennsylvania Academy and the Art Students League. He met a lot of people who would go on to be major influences on his career, like Arthur Carles, who introduced him to Steichen,
That's right.
would
Yeah.
be a pretty influential one. Oh, and this is an important one. Why are there so many Marin drawings? I don't know that he made many more than anybody else, but he kept them. That's one of the big secrets. And then, of course, in this case of the works coming to us, his family kept them, and his dealers kept them. And originally, many of them would have been in sketchbooks. The National Gallery still has 19 bound sketchbooks. Nobody else does have any. But they were disbound in order to be able to be separately shown and sold. So the drawings became very valuable, partially because if you try to go for the finished watercolors, they're expensive and more rare. But anybody have to
Well, I
add
think
on
his
to that, how he
process,
kept?
he was, I mean, one thing that with even just studying this collection, it was a practice for him to draw every day or at a continual, and it was part of his creative process. So I think that one reason why we have so many examples is because he kept them, but he was constantly working, and so I think it really gives us a chance to kind of look over his shoulder or kind of see how his line develops or what he was thinking about at the time.
Actually, here's an interesting one, talking about when Marin is working on multiple plates of similar compositions. Was the cost of the copper plate a problem or a factor? And of course, sometimes it's not copper. Sometimes it's
Yeah, I mean, in this case,
zinc.
well,
and
we,
other
we
things.
have 71 plates at all of his surviving etching plates, and we have a group of aluminum plates. But I don't believe it was a factor.
He was pretty
Doesn't seem to have
successful
been. He was
eventually.
And I mean, Marin supported him. I mean, basically in the beginning, it was sort of almost a sort of courtly-like setup, right? Where Marin just sort of supported, I mean, where Stieglitz supported him so he could do, guaranteed buying a certain amount of his work. So he would basically have sort of like a court artist, right? Like, you know, whatever you make belongs to me, and I'll give you money to, you know, to support
Yeah,
you.
I'll get it out there.
So I don't think that was ever
He was-
a big issue.
He was highly collected. For instance, Duncan Phillips, the founder of the Phillips Collection in Washington, was very, very keen on him. Ferdinand Howell, who gave a lot of the beautiful watercolors that are at the Columbus Museum. There were lots of people
Well, and as you noted,
became habitual collectors.
the Gallatin, the famous collector
Yes, Gallatin.
of modern and contemporary work, who gave a lot of work to the Philadelphia Museum of Art and collected Duchamp and all kinds of things, collected his work as well. So.
Yeah, and this is an interesting one, talking about have we done analysis on some of the paper, for instance, with the Horse and Hansom cab, the drawing, the question as to whether it's done in New York or Paris. We've tried to do a certain amount of just comparing papers and looking at them. Of course, he could easily have carried papers with him to and from Europe, and probably did to, I would think, more likely from Europe to America, because you could get such good paper in Europe of so many different kinds. But it's a tough one to get exact dates on some of these. His style stays pretty consistent if you're talking about just periods of months often, or he could be working in multiple styles at once. But we've done a lot of looking at what are called dandy roll marks. They're the marks that are on machine-made paper, so when it's molded from a cylinder rather than made flat by hand, if there are marks on there that it's where the paper is thinner, you sew little coils of wire on it so that you can mark who made the paper. We've been able to gather together some of those groups, and so a lot of the sketches we have much more precisely dated and associated than has been done in the past, or at least somewhat. There are times when all you can really do is kind of give it a decade or give it 15 years or something. There are times when his sketching style is just really tough to date. You don't necessarily know on what basis to do it. So we're getting that started, but it's an ongoing process.
Wishful thinking.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's wishful thinking. It's something that you can keep working on, but you may never be able to pin it down.
And he's not unusual in that sense, of course.
No.
I mean, artists don't necessarily date things, so you just get mired into learning as much about biography and materials and connections, and you still don't really know.
And here's one asking about some of the titles of the works have changed, especially if you look in the catalog, you'll see that we've changed some titles. In many cases, the titles that had become associated, especially with the very informal sketches, were just assigned to them by dealers. kind of randomly over the years. They don't have formal titles that he gave them. In any case where we know his title, where he's written it on there, we'll absolutely, totally stay with what he says. But in other cases, we've tried to be more consistent or precise, or if we find out more about something, it may change from place to place, or changing it from gorilla to gargantua. We do, in fact, know exactly what the gorilla drawing is of. There was only one gorilla in New York, and that he could have seen in New York, and that was Gargantua, the famous gorilla, who has a very sad story, by the way, that we won't go into.
Part of the project was to standardize the titles enough so that it articulated location or subject and was easy to search. And then also, this is just the beginning, and then would love for further kind of research to dive in. But any time that it was exhibited during Marin's life or had any indication that he described it in a certain way or labeled it and gave it a specific title, we went with that title.
Yeah,
so we spent a lot of time thinking this through, but yeah.
And artists also give different titles 2 years apart too. So which of the artist title do you want to use, the first one or the last one?
And that is so often is the sort of question that, especially with the very informal kinds of works, the most important thing is just to know what his intention was, and try to be able to keep track of them. One of the questions here is about Cubist influence on Marin. I would say absolutely, certainly. The man knew what was going on, and certainly he's working in a kind of Cubist influence, pseudo-Cubist mode often, never what you'd call formally or precisely.
And there's often the discussion, of course, of the futurist movement too, because the manifesto of the futurists was published in Paris in 2009, wasn't it? Was it first came out in the newspaper, and then in 1912 in New York City it was published again. So he was certainly aware of them as well, and that goes again to the motion and sense of movement and interest in all of that.
Mm-hmm. I think he's very sophisticated about knowing what's going on, but then of course he makes his own decisions about what he's interested in actually exploring. Mm-hmm. Just because he's aware of it doesn't mean he has to do it, but I think he was very intrigued by the futurists and by the cubists, and those are both movements that changed in themselves as they went forward. His art's changing the whole time.
But again, I think in terms of they touched on similar ideas that he was interested in.
Yes,
I don't think
absolutely.
it wasn't like he wanted to follow the cubists. They were exploring similar ideas that struck him that he was trying to articulate.
Well, as Ruth said, he's all about motion all the time. The motion he senses in the environment, things that he sees, things that he feels about it, his own motion as he creates. And so the futurists were particularly trying to catch motion and transformation. So it's natural that he would find their work of interest and maybe do variants off of it. We have, I think, 1 minute, so anybody have a closing statement that you'd like to make? Ruth, you want to
my
point us
closing
at the
statement is always look up close, get as close as you can, look as hard as you can.
And this is,
and that look what you see is more important than anything we're saying.
Absolutely, yes.
Well,
Look,
and I
find
think,
your own.
Anne, we should say I think the community has to thank the Arkansas Art Center and you and all of the people that worked on the show for opening this new door, because now we're aware of many more things, and we've talked about at least a half a dozen articles, books, exhibitions that should come down the line. So we look forward to further discussion.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, so I think we are we stopped now? Are we still?